Hey, welcome. Today we're going to start talking about the French Revolution, which is a very interesting time in European history and brings major changes to France, but it's also a very gruesome and bloody time in European history as well. So, the French Revolution is going to be the overthrow of the French monarchy, the king and queen, but it's also going to turn into a civil war and then eventually a war with much of Europe. The main symbol of the French Revolution is going to be the guillotine, which is a machine made to execute people, where you have the guillotine blade dropping and landing on a person's neck, cutting off their head. There you have an example of what would happen. So France had long been one of the most powerful countries in Europe. We talked about this with all the way back with Joan of Arc and the Hundred Years' War. It was ruled by some of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. But by the mid 1700s, France is really having a lot of problems. And by the time Louis XVI comes to power, who's going to be the main king we're going to talk about in this unit, France is struggling both economically and socially. And one thing you can see is 1775, that's also roughly the time period where the American Revolution is going on in the United States. So you have this French Revolution and the American Revolution kind of overlapping at points. So Louis himself, as you can see in this picture, is poorly prepared to lead the country. He's timid, lazy, he's indecisive, he's made fun of for being fat and overweight and eating way too much. So, war debt. You have war debt from the 7 Years' War and American Revolution. We're going to talk about royal spending with the building of the Palace of Versailles, all these ceremonies, the food. You have Madame Deficit, which is a nickname given to Marie Antoinette. You have food shortages, which mostly bread, as you can see in this picture here, which leads to starvation. And these are economic problems that are happening in France leading up to the French Revolution. And this is something that has to be settled. Louis decides to settle this by increasing the taxes on the common people, mostly the poor, who did not have money to pay for taxes in the first place. They didn't have money to pay for food. So the economic problems are going to become worse. So they have economic problems way back to the mid 1700s or even earlier, but the war debts from the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the building of the Palace of Versailles, Marie Antoinette, are going to cause more problems. And here you can see Marie Antoinette here, who we said earlier was given the nickname Madame Deficit. She was considered an outsider, unrelated, being unable to relate to the common people. You have food shortages, which result in famine, which is widespread hunger and starvation due to poor harvest, due to the weather, and poor government policies. And all this is going to lead to major economic problems. And we said Louis, the king at the time, is going to raise taxes on the poor, and he's going to start to reduce the privileges of the nobility to help pay off some of this spending. And here you see bread, which is a major part of the French diet. And here you can see French bread. Well, we'll talk more about the French bread later. So war debts. We have the 7 Years' War, which is really some people call the First World War. It's the largest war in the history of the world at this time. Almost every major European power was involved the Americas and Africa, and pretty much every major part of the globe was impacted some way. Now, two of the most powerful countries in the 7 Years' War were France and Britain, which is England, and they're going to suffer huge debts because of this, and they're going to fight each other. They've been fighting since the 100 Years' War, basically. They're considered longstanding enemies, and then they're going to fight again during the American Revolution. So when the 7 Years' War, or as we call the French and Indian War in the United States, is going to help lead the American Revolution because of these new things that Britain's going to impose on a colonist, including new taxes, and we create no taxation without representation. They're going to go in debt, going to help lead to the American Revolution, and France is going to get involved in the American Revolution by supporting the colonists against Britain, because France and Britain are huge rivals, and France is pretty much willing to mess with Britain regardless of the cost. So they're already facing financial crisis at this time, and they're going to give money and military support to help the United States, or what will become the United States. And the money Louis sent to help the United States would have been enough to feed and house 7 million French citizens for an entire year, which at that time would have been most of the population, because the population wasn't nearly as big back then as it is now. Another problem is the population is growing. So as the population of France is growing, they still don't have any more food. In fact, they have less food, which is going to lead to more starvation. So the American Revolution is going to further hurt France financially, and the success of the American Revolution is going to turn around and actually be bad for France as well, because it's going to help inspire the overthrow of the French monarchy, just as the colonists overthrew George, King of England. So Louis XIV, who would be Louis XVI's grandfather, decided to move the government from from Paris to Versailles to kind of give this distance between him and the common people. Now, this is a small town about 12 miles to the west or southwest of Paris. Now it's actually part of Paris. And he builds this giant palace and gardens and all sorts of crazy things there on what used to be a hunting cabin. And this palace is known as the Palace of Versailles. It's a symbol of power as an absolute monarch. It's one of the most famous palaces in the history of the world. It's still open today and one of the most visited tourist attractions in all of France. More people visit this than the Eiffel Tower. And here you can see a little picture of what it would look like. In the background, you see the fountain with the statues. Here's another picture here of the different gardens and the trees being just perfectly cut. This one gives you an idea of how big the actual palace is. Then you can see another angle, and you can see the fountains and the gardens. In addition to this, you can see to the left side of the screen kind of small villages that they built in. So the whole government is moved to Versailles. The royal family, but they also moved the government buildings there too. So the whole government's getting pulled away from Paris, where most of the people live. Now this one gives you a better idea of how large this thing is. This is about the size of Grand Island in terms of square feet or square miles. And you can see some of these fountains are very, very long that are there. You can see this canal kind of down the middle here that you would use for sledding and other things. Showed this picture already. Here's a statue of some horses, and artwork was common here. You can see a golden gate and the artwork up above. Now here's the inside of the Hall of Mirrors, what it looks like today. And this is still there today. Some of the stuff was taken out during the French Revolution, but they tried to bring a lot of it back and try to recreate it as close as possible to what it looked like back then. Here's what you'd actually look like if you visited, so you could see it actually be really crowded if you were to visit today. And maybe not right now you could visit it, but it is open to the public most of the time. And here's a picture of the hall, kind of near the Hall of Mirrors, where you can kind of see the artwork on the ceiling and all that is involved. The chandeliers, more artwork on the side. Here's a bedroom with the royal painting of the paint, and then you have the artwork on the sides and the artwork hanging on the walls and the ceiling as well, and the gold that was involved in this as well. And here you can see this is not actually part of the palace, but outside the palace they had all these different buildings for Marie or Louis, hunting lodges and little kind of villages that these people could live at and go on vacation at. So this very luxurious, very, very expensive, by today's standards, cost $2 billion. There's no way you could buy it today. It's crazy, crazy fancy, while most people are starving to death. So speaking of the royal family, you have the Palace of Versailles. In addition to this, you have all these famous parties, dressing ceremonies, and just waste money on things that nobody really paid attention to outside the royal family. Expensive foods, fashion, jewelry. And a lot of this was to keep up appearance and show their power to their people and to the rest of the world. And because of this, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette become very unpopular as things get worse. You have the food shortages, you have poor harvest, bad weather, market manipulations, failed government policies. All this is going to lead to flour shortage. Flour shortage is going to lead to a bread shortage, and bread's the main food source for France at this time. The cost of bread is going to skyrocket. It's going to cost, for a loaf of bread, it's going to cost over a month's salary. Most people aren't going to have enough food to survive to eat. The average French person ate roughly 2 pounds of bread a day. So it's not really like they have something else to fall back on. This was their diet. So kind of recap. You have economic problems that are going to lead to the French Revolution, including war debts of the 7 Years' War and American Revolution. You have the royal spending on the Palace of Versailles, all these fancy ceremonies and parties and food. You have Madame Deficit, Marie Antoinette spending a bunch of money, which you're going to learn about in the videos and in other places as well as we get to that. You have food shortages, mostly around the fact that they're running out of wheat and bread, which is going to lead to starvation. And Louis' response to all this is to increase taxes on the common people, which is just going to make matters even worse. So every time Louis tries to help, it's actually going to make things worse than what was before. So Louis and Marie Antoinette's popularity is shrinking, and they're going to have all sorts of other problems with social problems in addition to the economic problems. The unfair class system, the third estate, we talk about that, the ideas of enlightenment and the emergence of the bourgeoisie. So social problems developed due to these things, and the middle class is going to rise up and really start this up along with the peasants. So you have the three estates, which is the unfair class system. You have the first estate, which is the church officials, the clergy, which is the Roman Catholic Church. Almost all of France at this time belongs to the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation really had not reached France the way it did in England and Germany and some of these countries we talked about while we talked about the Reformation. You have the second estate, which is nobility. This is inherited. This goes all the way back to the Middle Ages under feudalism, where the king would give up land in return for loyalty. These might have been former knights or lords back from the Middle Ages, and this is passed down from generation to generation. So there's nothing you can do to gain or lose this status, really, unless you did something really bad. Then you have the third estate, which is the common people. This is everyone else. And when we talk about the common people, we mostly think of the peasants, but this would also include merchants, doctors, lawyers as well. And no matter how wealthy you got, if you're a member of the third estate, you would stay a member of the third estate. You can see these in a picture here. Church officials on the left here, that's the first estate. You have the nobility here in the middle, and then on the right you have the common people, the third estate. And each one of these social classes under the States General would get one vote. So usually the first and second estate would vote together, and then the third estate would be left over, and they would not really get anything that they wanted. So it's going to be the third estate that really pushes for the French Revolution. So the first and second estate make up less than 3% of the population, but they're going to control 2 votes in the States General. So what we have here, these two are going to control 1 vote each. So 2 out of the 3 votes are going to go to the first and second estate. And this States General is their legislative assembly at this time. It's like their Congress or their Senate before the French Revolution, although they wouldn't be always active. These people enjoyed special privileges, controlled much of the country's wealth and political power. However, the third estate makes up over 97% of the population, or roughly 97% of the population, and it would change over time. And they only get 1/3 of the votes. So they would likely get outvoted and never get really anything that they wanted in terms of government. So politically, they were powerless. And even above the first and second estate, you also have the king, who would make most of the decisions irregardless of what anyone else had to say. And these people might include lawyers, doctors, and merchants, but most of these people were very poor, peasant class, and they were forced to pay high taxes. And a lot of these people suffered from famine, starvation before the French Revolution. So you have your 3 estates again, the church at the top, the nobility as the second estate, and then you have the third estate, which is commoners. You can see this graphic here. We see the royalty, the church, and here in the middle, and then they're basically piggybacking on the third estate, which is on their hands and knees crawling across in chains. So the ideas of enlightenment really inspire these people of the third estate to rise up and try to gain more political power. And one of these people, you have lots of these people. The one that really pushed in America was John Locke, who was an English philosopher. So ideas of John Locke and Rousseau and all these people are going to inspire the middle class to rise up, and they're going to inspire the third estate to raise up as well. So this happens around the 1600s. They started questioning authority, including the church, including the royal family, equality, and wanted freedom. Enlightenment thinkers would challenge the authority of the absolute monarchs, the Catholic Church, the privileges of the titled nobility, and they really had their power from the powerful bourgeoisie, which was the middle class, who really started all this. And here you have this pyramid again of the social classes of the 3 estates. So Louis and Marie Antoinette were unpopular, the third estate's unhappy, the Enlightenment taught people to question authority, and the bourgeoisie wanted change. And we went through the social problems of the unfair class system, Enlightenment, the emergence of the bourgeoisie. Now this is going to lead to the tennis court oath, the National Assembly, eventually the storming of the Bastille, and then you have the March on Versailles. And this is when the French Revolution becomes violent, which we'll learn about in the next lesson. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.